Daniel Harper had always dreamed of escaping the noise and chaos of city life. For years, he saved every penny, worked overtime, and sacrificed vacations just to make his dream a reality. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of planning and patience, he found it. A cozy little house nestled on 5 acres of land in the small, quiet town of Willow Creek. The property was everything Daniel had ever wanted. Towering oak trees stood tall like ancient guardians, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. A crystal-clear creek meandered along one side of the land, its soothing sound creating a natural melody that made Daniel feel at peace from the moment he stepped onto the property. The first few days were magical. Daniel spent hours exploring every inch of his new home, marveling at how lucky he was to have found such a perfect place. He imagined lazy mornings sipping coffee on the porch, afternoons tending to his vegetable garden, and evenings sitting by a crackling fire pit under a blanket of stars. It wasn't just land, it was freedom. Freedom from the cramped apartment he'd lived in for years. Freedom from nosy neighbors who knew too much about his business. And most importantly, freedom from feeling like he didn't belong somewhere. But as the saying goes, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. On the third day, while Daniel was clearing some brush near the edge of his property, he noticed something odd. There were tire tracks cutting through the grass, deep grooves left behind by something heavy and loud. At first he thought maybe someone had accidentally driven onto his land by mistake. But when he saw fresh tracks again the next morning, he realized this wasn't a one-time mishap. Someone, or multiple people, was using his land regularly, without permission. Curious and slightly annoyed, Daniel decided to investigate. He walked along the path where the tire marks led and discovered a narrow dirt trail winding through the woods. It wasn't wide enough for cars, but it was clearly used frequently by ATVs and dirt bikes. The trail stretched across his property, disappearing into the trees before re-emerging on the other side. Daniel frowned. This was his land. Who gave these people the right to tear through it whenever they pleased? He asked around town to see if anyone could shed light on the situation. Most of his neighbors were friendly enough, eager to welcome him to the community. When he mentioned the trail during casual conversations, their reactions ranged from sheepish smiles to outright laughter. "Oh yeah," one elderly neighbor chuckled. "That's Karen's trail." "Karen?" Daniel asked, confused. "Karen Miller," the man replied. "She runs the HOA around here. She's been using that trail for years, decades really. Lots of folks do. It's kind of a tradition." "A tradition?" Daniel echoed, raising an eyebrow. "On my property?" "Well." The neighbor hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Technically, I guess it's not legal, but no one's ever complained before. Karen says it's part of the neighborhood's charm. Keeps things lively, you know." Daniel didn't know. In fact, he felt a growing sense of unease. Tradition or not, this was his land now. He hadn't bought it so strangers could race through it on motorized vehicles, leaving ruts in the ground and scaring away wildlife. Still, he tried to stay calm. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Karen would understand once he explained his perspective. A few days later, Daniel got his chance to meet Karen face to face. Or rather, he met her ATV first. While he was working in his garden, the roar of an engine shattered the peaceful silence. Before he could react, a shiny red ATV came barreling down the trail, kicking up dirt and debris as it passed. The driver barely glanced in his direction. A middle-aged woman with sunglasses perched atop her head and a smug expression on her face. That must be Karen, Daniel thought grimly. He waved her down, stepping onto the trail to block her way. "Excuse me," he called out, raising his voice to be heard over the engine. "Can we talk for a second?" Karen slowed the ATV to a stop but didn't turn off the engine. Instead, she crossed her arms and looked at him expectantly. "What's up?" she asked, her tone clipped. "I'm Daniel Harper," he said, forcing a polite smile. "I just moved in. I wanted to let you know that I'll be putting up signs soon asking people not to use this trail anymore. It's private property and I'd like to keep it secure." Karen stared at him for a long moment, then burst out laughing. "Oh, honey, you're funny," she said, shaking her head. This trail has been here longer than you've lived in this town. Trust me, no one's going to stop using it because of a couple of signs. Daniel blinked, caught off guard by her dismissive attitude. I'm serious, he said firmly. This is my land. I don't want strangers driving through it. Karen's smile vanished, replaced by a cold glare. Listen, she snapped, revving the engine for emphasis. You might own the land, but that doesn't mean you can just cut off access. People rely on this trail. If you try to block it, you'll regret it. With that ominous warning, she sped off, leaving Daniel standing in a cloud of dust. He watched her go, his heart pounding with frustration and disbelief. Who did this woman think she was? Did she honestly believe she could intimidate him into giving up his rights as a property owner? As the days passed, Daniel couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. He started noticing more activity on the trail, more ATVs, more dirt bikes, more people ignoring his presence entirely. Some riders even waved cheerfully as they zoomed past, apparently oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing. Others gave him dirty looks as if daring him to say something. It became clear that Karen wasn't exaggerating when she said people relied on the trail. To many of his neighbors, it wasn't just a convenience. It was a way of life. They treated it like a public road, assuming it belonged to everyone simply because it always had. But Daniel wasn't about to let tradition override legality. He had worked too hard for this land to let others take advantage of it. Still, he knew he couldn't handle this alone. If Karen and her friends refused to respect his wishes, he'd need backup. And so Daniel began researching his options, determined to protect his property and his sanity from the chaos threatening to invade his peaceful retreat. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a battle that would test his patience, his resolve, and his faith in humanity. Daniel knew he couldn't let things continue the way they were. The constant roar of engines tearing through his property was driving him crazy, and Karen's dismissive attitude during their first meeting had only made matters worse. He needed a plan, one that would assert his rights as a property owner without escalating tensions unnecessarily. After all, he didn't want to start a war with his neighbors. He just wanted them to respect his boundaries. His first step was to attend an HOA meeting. It wasn't something he was particularly excited about. Daniel had always preferred quiet independence over community involvement, but he figured it was the best way to address the issue directly. Maybe if he explained his situation calmly and reasonably, people would understand where he was coming from. At the very least, it would give him a chance to gauge how others in the neighborhood felt about the trail. The meeting was held in the basement of the local community center, a drab room filled with folding chairs and fluorescent lights. Daniel arrived early, hoping to introduce himself to a few neighbors before things got underway. Most of them greeted him warmly enough, though there was an undercurrent of curiosity in their questions. "So, you're the new guy on Willow Lane?" one older woman asked, her tone friendly but probing. "How are you settling in?" "Pretty well," Daniel replied with a polite smile, "though I've been dealing with some unexpected challenges." Before he could elaborate, Karen swept into the room like a storm cloud, her presence immediately commanding everyone's attention. She wore a blazer that looked more suited for a corporate boardroom than a small-town HOA meeting, and her sharp heels clicked loudly against the tiled floor. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her confident stride suggested she was used to being in charge. As she took her seat at the front of the room, Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't going to be easy. Once the meeting began, Karen launched into a lengthy update on upcoming events, a bake sale, a charity drive, and plans for a summer block party. Daniel listened patiently, waiting for his turn to speak. Finally, when the agenda opened up for general discussion, he raised his hand. "I'd like to bring up an issue regarding my property," he said, standing up so everyone could see him. "There's a trail running through my land that's been used by ATVs and dirt bikes. While I understand it's been a long-standing tradition, I need to close it off for personal reasons. I'll be installing a fence soon to ensure my property is secure." The room fell silent. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Karen leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. I'm putting up a fence, Daniel repeated, keeping his tone steady. It's my right as a property owner. I hope everyone will respect that. Karen's face flushed red and she slammed her hands down on the table. You can't do that, she exclaimed, her voice rising with each word. That trail has been here for decades. It's part of our community. You can't just cut it off because you feel like it. Daniel blinked, surprised by her outburst. I'm not trying to cause problems, he said carefully, but this is my land. I have every legal right to control who uses it. Oh, please, Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. You think you're so special because you bought a big piece of land? Newsflash, you're not the first person to live there. Other owners never had a problem with the trail. Why should we suffer? Because you decided to move in? The room erupted into murmurs as other neighbors chimed in. Some sided with Karen, arguing that the trail was essential for recreation and convenience. Others seemed hesitant, glancing between Daniel and Karen as if unsure whose side to take. One man spoke up timidly, saying, maybe there's a compromise, like, could we use part of the trail instead of all of it? No compromises, Karen snapped, cutting him off. This isn't negotiable. If Daniel puts up a fence, he's declaring war on the entire neighborhood. Daniel clenched his fists beneath the table, fighting to keep his temper in check. He hadn't expected this level of hostility, but backing down now would only make things worse. Look, he said firmly, addressing the group. I get that the trail means a lot to some of you, but it's trespassing. Plain and simple. I'm within my rights to stop it. Karen stood abruptly, pointing a finger at him. You'll regret this, she hissed. Mark my words. With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving behind a tense silence. After the meeting, Daniel tried to shake off the confrontation. He knew Karen wasn't going to let this go quietly, but he also knew he couldn't afford to second-guess himself. Over the next few days, he focused on moving forward with his plans. He contacted a local contractor to install a sturdy wooden fence along the boundary of his property, blocking the trail entirely. The work was scheduled to begin the following weekend, and Daniel hoped that once the fence was up, people would finally get the message. But Karen wasn't about to sit idly by while Daniel challenged her authority. That Friday evening, as Daniel was unloading groceries from his car, he noticed a group of neighbors gathered near the edge of his property. They were talking animatedly, gesturing toward the trail and occasionally glancing in his direction. When Daniel approached, they fell silent, their expressions ranging from awkward to hostile. Hey, Daniel, one of them said hesitantly. We just wanted to talk about the fence. There's nothing to discuss, Daniel replied, crossing his arms. This is my decision. I've already explained why I'm doing it. But Karen says it's unfair. Another neighbor interjected. She thinks you're trying to ruin the neighborhood. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm not trying to ruin anything. I just want privacy and security. Is that really too much to ask? No one answered. Instead, they exchanged uneasy glances before dispersing, muttering amongst themselves. Daniel watched them go, feeling a growing sense of isolation. It was clear that Karen had been working hard to turn the neighborhood against him, painting him as some kind of villain who didn't care about community spirit. The truth was far from that. He simply wanted what any homeowner deserved: control over their own property. By Saturday morning, the contractor arrived bright and early to start building the fence. Daniel supervised closely, making sure everything was done properly. As the posts went up and the panels began to take shape, he allowed himself a small sense of satisfaction. Finally, he was taking action to protect what was rightfully his, but Karen wasn't about to let him enjoy even a moment of peace. Around noon, the sound of screeching tires announced her arrival. Daniel turned to see her white SUV pulling into his driveway, kicking up dust as she stomped toward him, her face contorted with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she screamed, jabbing a finger at the half-built fence. "You're ruining everything. People need that trail." Daniel squared his shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "Karen, I've already explained this. My land, my rules. You've been trespassing long enough." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment Daniel thought she might lunge at him. Instead, she whipped out her phone and started snapping pictures of the fence. "You'll see," she spat. "This isn't over." As she stormed back to her car, Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He knew Karen wasn't bluffing. She was the type of person who thrived on drama and conflict. Whatever she had planned, it wouldn't be pretty. But Daniel refused to back down. He had fought too hard for this land to let anyone bully him into giving up his rights. Whatever came next, he would face it head on. The fence was finally up. It stood tall and sturdy, stretching across the boundary of Daniel's property like a silent guardian. The wooden panels gleamed in the sunlight, freshly painted with a coat of sealant to protect against the elements. To Daniel, it wasn't just a barrier. It was a symbol of his determination to reclaim control over his land. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace wash over him as he walked along the perimeter, admiring the work that had been done. But peace, as Daniel was quickly learning, was a rare commodity in Willow Creek. By Monday morning, word of the fence had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Karen, ever the self-appointed queen bee, wasted no time rallying her troops. That afternoon, Daniel heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching gravel as Karen's white SUV screeched into his driveway. She didn't bother parking properly. Instead, she left the vehicle at an angle, half blocking the entrance as if to make a statement. Daniel stepped outside, bracing himself for what was sure to be another confrontation. Sure enough, Karen emerged from her car, slamming the door so hard it echoed through the quiet afternoon air. Her face was flushed, her eyes blazing with anger as she marched toward him. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, pointing, an accusatory finger at the fence. "You've completely cut off access to the trail. Do you have any idea how many people rely on it?" "I'm aware," Daniel replied calmly, folding his arms across his chest. "And I've already explained why I'm doing this. This is private property, Karen. You don't get to use it whenever you feel like it." Karen threw her hands up in exasperation. "Private property? Oh, please. That trail has been here for decades. Decades. Longer than you've even lived in this town. Who are you to come in here and act like you own the place?" "I do own the place," Daniel shot back, his voice firm but controlled. "I have the deed to prove it. If anyone has a problem, they can take it up with the law." Karen scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. "You really don't understand, do you? This isn't about some piece of paper. This is about community. People need that trail. Kids ride their bikes on it, families use it to get around, and now you've gone and ruined everything because you're too selfish to share." "Selfish?" Daniel repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not being selfish, I'm protecting my rights. Just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't mean it's right. I didn't buy this land so strangers could treat it like their personal highway." Karen's lips curled into a sneer. "Oh, I see how it is. Mr. Big Shot thinks he's better than everyone else. Well, let me tell you something. You're going to regret this. Mark my words." With that ominous warning, she stormed back to her car and sped off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and tension. Daniel watched her go, his jaw tightening. He knew Karen wouldn't let this go quietly, but he also knew he couldn't afford to back down. The fence was non-negotiable. It was his line in the sand, and he intended to defend it no matter what. Over the next few days, Karen launched a full-scale campaign against Daniel. Flyers began appearing all over the neighborhood, taped to trees, lampposts, and mailboxes. They featured bold headlines like, "New Neighbor Destroys Community Trail," and "Is Daniel Harper Anti-Community?" Beneath the inflammatory titles were accusations claiming that Daniel was ruining the neighborhood by cutting off access to the trail. Some flyers even included grainy photos of the fence, as if it were some kind of crime scene evidence. At first, Daniel tried to ignore them, focusing instead on settling into his new home. But the flyers weren't the only thing spreading through Willow Creek. Rumors were swirling, fueled by Karen's relentless gossip. Neighbors who had once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact or muttered under their breath when he passed by. A few even went out of their way to confront him, accusing him of being antisocial and unreasonable. "You're making things difficult for everyone," one man said during a tense encounter at the local grocery store. "Why can't you just let people use the trail? "It's not your decision to make," Daniel replied, keeping his tone level despite his frustration. "If you have a problem, talk to Karen. She's the one stirring the pot." But Karen wasn't content to stop there. As the week wore on, Daniel noticed more subtle forms of retaliation. His mailbox was knocked over twice in a single day, forcing him to replace it with a sturdier model. Late at night, he heard the distant rumble of ATVs revving their engines near the edge of his property, taunting him with the sound of defiance. One morning he found garbage bags dumped in his driveway, their contents spilling onto the ground in a disgusting mess. The breaking point came on Friday evening, when Daniel discovered that someone had spray-painted graffiti on his brand-new fence. The words, "bully" and "selfish jerk" were scrawled across the wood in bright red paint, marring the pristine surface. Daniel stared at the vandalism in disbelief, his fists clenched at his sides. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to send a message, they were trying to intimidate him into giving up. That night, Daniel made a decision. Enough was enough. He couldn't keep ignoring the harassment and hoping it would go away. It was clear that Karen and her supporters weren't going to back down unless he took action. The next morning, he installed security cameras around his property, positioning them strategically to capture footage of anyone approaching the fence or driveway. He also contacted a lawyer to discuss his options, determined to protect himself, legally if necessary. To Karen's credit, or perhaps her detriment, she underestimated Daniel's resolve. On Sunday afternoon, while reviewing the security footage, Daniel spotted something shocking. Karen's teenage son, Jake, sneaking onto his property late at night. The boy was caught on camera using a knife to slash the tires of Daniel's truck, laughing to himself as he worked. Even worse, Karen herself appeared briefly in the background, standing by her car and watching the vandalism unfold without intervening. Daniel felt a surge of anger, but forced himself to stay calm. He copied the footage onto a USB drive and brought it to the police station the following morning. When the officers reviewed the video, they agreed that it constituted criminal mischief and promised to investigate further. Meanwhile, Daniel filed a formal complaint with the HOA, attaching copies of the footage as evidence. The backlash was swift. When news of the vandalism broke, several neighbors who had initially sided with Karen began to distance themselves from her. Even longtime members of the HOA expressed discomfort with her behavior, calling it obsessive and unreasonable. One elderly woman approached Daniel at the post office, apologizing profusely for doubting him earlier. "We had no idea she'd go this far," she admitted. "She's always been pushy, but this is something else." As for Karen, she became increasingly isolated, her reputation tarnished by the scandal. Her attempts to rally support fizzled out as more people turned against her, unwilling to associate with someone who encouraged such extreme measures. Daniel, meanwhile, remained steadfast, refusing to engage in petty arguments or retaliate against his critics. He focused on reinforcing his boundaries, knowing that patience and persistence were key to winning this battle. By the end of the week, the neighborhood seemed to settle into an uneasy truce. The trail remained blocked, the fence untouched. Daniel continued working on his garden, enjoying the quiet solitude he had fought so hard to preserve. Though tensions lingered beneath the surface, he allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction. He had stood his ground, defended his rights, and exposed the truth, and in doing so, he had proven that sometimes standing up for yourself is worth the fight. The fallout from the vandalism footage spread like wildfire through Willow Creek, but not in the way Karen had hoped. Instead of rallying support for her cause, the evidence against her and her son only deepened the divide within the community. Neighbors who had once been indifferent or even slightly sympathetic to Karen's crusade began to distance themselves. Some felt guilty for having doubted Daniel, while others were simply appalled by the lengths Karen had gone to in order to protect the trail. Even members of the HOA started avoiding her calls, unwilling to be dragged into what was quickly becoming a public relations disaster. For Daniel, however, this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his ongoing battle. While he appreciated the shift in public opinion, he knew that Karen wasn't someone who gave up easily. If anything, exposing her schemes would likely push her further into desperation. And true to form, Karen didn't disappoint. Over the next few weeks, she launched a relentless campaign of harassment designed to wear him down emotionally, financially, and legally. It started with frivolous complaints filed with the HOA. Karen accused Daniel of violating aesthetic guidelines, claiming his fence was an eyesore that detracted from the neighborhood's charm. She argued that its height and design clashed with the rustic, natural look of the surrounding properties. When the HOA board reviewed the complaint, they found no merit to her claims. The fence was well-maintained, functional, and compliant with local regulations. But the process of investigating the allegations still forced Daniel to spend hours gathering documentation and attending meetings, draining his time and energy. Karen didn't stop there. Next, she encouraged other neighbors to report him for
imagined code violations. One neighbor claimed Daniel's garden shed encroached on communal land. It didn't.
Another alleged that his outdoor lighting was too bright and disturbed their sleep. It wasn't. Each accusation required Daniel to produce proof of compliance, which meant more trips to City Hall, more phone calls with inspectors, and more sleepless nights spent worrying about how far Karen would go. Then came the noise complaints. Every evening, Daniel enjoyed sitting by his fire pit, listening to music or reading a book as he unwound from the day. It was a peaceful ritual, one that helped him cope with the stress of the situation. But soon, Karen began filing noise complaints, alleging that his activities disturbed the peace. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. Her own antics had turned the neighborhood upside down, yet somehow he was the problem. At first, these complaints seemed minor, almost laughable. But when the police showed up at his door one Friday night after a particularly loud ATV rally nearby, Daniel realized Karen's strategy. She was trying to make him appear unreasonable by turning the tables. She wanted authorities, and the community, to see him as the troublemaker, the one causing disruptions and making life difficult for everyone else. Daniel refused to take the bait. He kept meticulous records of every interaction with law enforcement, documenting dates, times, and details. He also installed sound meters around his property to prove that his activities were well within acceptable decibel limits. When officers reviewed the data, they dismissed the complaints outright, leaving Karen red-faced and fuming. But Karen's most audacious move came one Saturday afternoon when she organized a protest outside Daniel's house. A group of ATV enthusiasts, many of whom Daniel had never met, gathered in his driveway, honking horns, revving engines, and shouting slogans like, "Save our trail," and "Respect tradition." The noise was deafening, shaking the windows, and startling the wildlife. Daniel stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. He considered calling the police, but something stopped him. This wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about standing firm in the face of intimidation. So instead of retreating inside, Daniel grabbed a folding chair, sat down on his porch, and opened a book. He ignored the commotion, flipping pages as if nothing unusual was happening. His calm demeanor infuriated the protesters, especially Karen, who paced back and forth, yelling insults and trying to provoke a reaction. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she shouted, pointing at him. "Sitting there like you're better than us. Well, guess what? You're not fooling anyone." Daniel didn't respond. He simply turned a page, his expression unreadable. After nearly 2 hours of futile attempts to rile him, the crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves about how unreasonable he was. By sunset, only Karen remained, glaring at him from across the yard. Finally, she stomped back to her car and drove off, leaving behind a mess of tire tracks and litter. While the protest failed to break Daniel's resolve, it did have one unintended consequence. It galvanized support for him among certain neighbors. Several people approached him afterward, apologizing for doubting him earlier and thanking him for standing up to Karen's bullying. One couple even offered to help clean up the debris left behind by the protesters, saying they admired his patience and determination. Encouraged by this show of solidarity, Daniel decided to take a more proactive approach. He reached out to local media outlets, sharing his story and presenting the security footage of Karen and Jake vandalizing his property. Journalists were intrigued by the David versus Goliath nature of the conflict, a lone homeowner standing up to a powerful, overbearing HOA leader. Within days, articles began appearing online, highlighting Daniel's struggle and condemning Karen's behavior. The publicity put additional pressure on the HO rules and forced them to address the growing controversy. Meanwhile, Daniel continued strengthening his legal position. With guidance from his lawyer, he filed a restraining order against Karen, citing her repeated attempts to intimidate him and damage his property. He also pressed charges against Jake for criminal mischief, ensuring that the teenager faced consequences for his actions. Both moves sent a clear message. Daniel wasn't backing down, and he was prepared to use every tool at his disposal to protect himself. As the weeks passed, the tide turned decisively in Daniel's favor. The combination of negative press, mounting legal challenges, and dwindling community support left Karen increasingly isolated. Her once loyal followers abandoned her, unwilling to risk association with someone whose behavior had become so extreme. Even her own family grew distant. Jake avoided eye contact whenever Daniel saw him around town, clearly ashamed of his role in the vandalism. By the end of the month, Karen's influence in Willow Creek had all but evaporated. What had started as a dispute over a simple fence had spiraled into a full-blown reckoning, exposing her manipulative tactics and vindictive personality. For Daniel, the victory was bittersweet. He hadn't asked for any of this. He just wanted to live in peace on his own land. But the experience had taught him valuable lessons about resilience, perseverance, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it feels like the whole world is against you. And though the scars of the conflict would linger, for his property, his relationships, and his trust in others, Daniel knew one thing for certain. He had reclaimed his sanctuary. The fence stood tall, unbroken and defiant, a testament to his refusal to let anyone trample on his rights. As he looked out over his land, now quiet and serene once again, Daniel allowed himself a small smile. He had won, not because he sought revenge, but because he refused to give up. The courtroom was a solemn place, its walls painted a dull beige that seemed to swallow sound. Rows of wooden benches stretched toward the front, where a raised platform held the judge's seat and a long table for lawyers. Daniel sat nervously, on one side his attorney beside him, flipping through papers with practiced ease. Across the aisle, Karen glared daggers at him, her face pale but determined. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she barely acknowledged it, too focused on glaring at Daniel as if sheer hatred could change the outcome. The hearing began, with Judge Mary Thompson, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. She listened intently as both sides presented their cases. Karen's lawyer argued passionately about tradition and community spirit, claiming Daniel's actions were selfish and divisive. But when Daniel's lawyer stood up, he laid out the facts clearly and concisely. Proof of ownership, evidence of trespassing, and the security footage showing Jake vandalizing Daniel's property. The room fell silent as the video played, the grainy images leaving no doubt about what had happened. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he kept his testimony simple and honest. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "I didn't move to Willow Creek to cause trouble. I came here for peace and quiet, a place where I could build a life without constant intrusion. That trail has been used for years, yes, but it's on my land. No matter how much people may want it, they don't have the right to use it without permission." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically, earning a stern glance from the judge. "Ms. Miller," Judge Thompson said sharply, "if you interrupt again, I'll hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Karen muttered, slumping back into her chair. After hours of arguments and cross-examinations, Judge Thompson finally delivered her verdict. "This case is straightforward," she declared, her tone firm. "Mr. Harper is the rightful owner of the property in question, and Ms. Miller knowingly allowed her son to commit acts of vandalism against him. Furthermore, her attempts to harass and intimidate Mr. Harper are unacceptable. I am granting a restraining order against Ms. Miller, requiring her to stay at least 500 feet away from Mr. Harper and his property. Additionally, she will pay restitution for damages caused and complete 30 days of community service. Case dismissed. The gavel struck the desk with a resounding crack echoing through the silent courtroom. For a moment, no one moved. Then Karen shot to her feet, her face red with fury. "This isn't fair," she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Daniel. "You think you've won? You haven't seen the last of me." "Sit down, Ms. Miller," Judge Thompson ordered, her voice cold as steel. When Karen hesitated, 2 bailiffs stepped forward, ready to escort her out if necessary. With a final glare at Daniel, she stormed from the room, her heels clicking loudly against the tiled floor. Back in Willow Creek, news of the ruling spread quickly. Neighbors who had once sided with Karen, or at least stayed neutral, began reaching out to Daniel, offering apologies and support. One elderly couple brought over a homemade pie, thanking him for standing up to Karen's bullying. A young family invited him to a barbecue, saying they admired his courage. Even some former members of the HOA expressed regret for not speaking out sooner, admitting they had been afraid of Karen's wrath. At first, Daniel was cautious about accepting these gestures. He couldn't help but wonder if they were genuine or simply a reaction to Karen's downfall. But over time, he realized that most people truly meant well. They hadn't known how to handle Karen's behavior before, but seeing someone stand up to her had inspired them to reconsider their own roles in the community. Slowly, Daniel began to feel like part of Willow Creek, not just as a homeowner but as a neighbor. Still, the scars of the conflict lingered. The graffiti on his fence had been scrubbed clean, but faint outlines remained, reminders of the hostility he'd faced. His mailbox still bore scratches from where it had been knocked over repeatedly, and though the ATVs no longer tore through his property, he sometimes heard their engines roaring in the distance, a subtle reminder that not everyone had forgiven him. But Daniel refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his life and making the most of his hard-won sanctuary. He expanded his garden, planting rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that thrived in the rich soil. He built a small workshop near the creek, where he spent hours tinkering with woodworking projects. On weekends, he hosted bonfires for the neighbors who had supported him, sharing stories and laughter under the stars. As the months passed, Willow Creek began to heal. Without Karen's influence, the HOA meetings became less contentious and more productive. New initiatives emerged, such as a community garden and a volunteer cleanup crew to maintain public spaces. Even the ATV enthusiasts found alternative routes, proving that compromise was possible when people worked together. For Karen, however, things took a darker turn. Humiliated by the court ruling and ostracized by many of her former allies, she struggled to regain her footing in the community. Her attempts to rally support for another protest fizzled out almost immediately, and her social circle shrank to a handful of loyal but increasingly frustrated friends. Eventually, she put her house on the market and moved away, leaving behind only whispers of her infamous meltdown over a simple fence. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel stood on his porch, sipping coffee as golden sunlight filtered through the trees. The air smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke, and the only sounds were birdsong and the gentle rustle of branches swaying in the breeze. It was everything he had dreamed of when he first bought the property, and more. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the sleepless nights, the heated arguments, the moments of doubt and fear. It hadn't been easy, and there had been times when he wondered if it was worth it. But looking around now at the peaceful haven he had created, he knew the answer was yes. Standing up for himself hadn't just protected his land, it had given him a sense of purpose and pride. As he walked down to check on his garden, Daniel noticed a familiar figure approaching from the road. It was Sarah, a neighbor who had quietly supported him throughout the ordeal. She waved and called out, "Hey, Daniel, got a minute?" "Sure," he replied, smiling. "What's up?" "I wanted to thank you again," she said, shifting awkwardly. "You really changed things around here. People are starting to realize we can solve problems without resorting to, well, whatever Karen did." Daniel chuckled softly. "It wasn't just me. Everyone had a choice to make, and I'm glad so many chose to do the right thing." Sarah nodded, then hesitated before adding, "Listen, we're planning a neighborhood potluck next weekend. Nothing fancy, just food and good company. I know it might be weird after everything that's happened, but I hope you'll come." For a moment, Daniel considered declining. The idea of sitting among people who had once doubted him still made him uneasy. But then he remembered how far they, and he, had come. "I'll be there," he said finally, returning her smile. "Thanks for asking." As Sarah walked away, Daniel felt a warmth spread through him. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Some wounds ran too deep for that. But it was acceptance. Acceptance that life in a community wasn't perfect, but it could be better. Better because people were willing to learn, to grow, and to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. And as he turned back to his garden, the sun warm on his face, Daniel knew he had finally found the peace he'd been searching for all along.